It is Thursday, the 12th of November, 2020, and you're listening to Skeptics with a K, the podcast for science, reason, and critical thinking. Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, a non-profit organisation for the promotion of scientific skepticism on Merseyside around the UK and internationally. I am your host, Mike Hall. With me today is Marsh.
Hello.
And Alice.
Hello.
And Joe Biden won the election.
Joe Biden won the election. Before that, Mike, actually related to that, your opening was very somber there. Much more somber. It wasn't kind of, it's Thursday. It is Thursday. Like, are you disappointed that Trump lost?
No, what I'm doing, you see, part of the problem is, listeners will have noticed, the incredibly variable audio quality on this show since lockdown, since we're just recording at home on whatever kit what we can get hold of, instead of the nice headset
which is
rigs.
limited because of lockdown.
Yes, there is an exacerbating factor in there to make it not just that we need to use the kit, but also we can't find a lot of the kit because everyone needs to use the kit.
So I'm trying to be a little bit more snooker commentator and just be a little bit closer to the mic and a little bit gentler instead of loud, so it all bounces off the walls and echoes back and makes me sound horribly roomy. I'll find out the hard way after this show goes out whether that's been successful or not.
Well, listeners, write in. What you need is one of those commentary microphones, the ones that rest on your top lip like a little Hitler mustache.
Yeah.
There you go. And here he goes now. This is Mike Hall about to commentate and tell people that the placebo effect is bullshit. And he's done it. It is bullshit. It is bullshit.
More on that later. Those lip mics are actually what they use for the Dalek voices as well. They use a little lip mic, like a snooker commentator or a horse racing commentator. Just sports commentators. They, for some reason, they just want to bellow into a microphone half a centimetre from their face.
Well, sports commentators, the thing is, they've all got a very distinctive style. Like I play a lot of football games on like PC. I play a lot of Football Manager, things like that. I find it really hard not to commentate on my players as they're doing stuff. And when you do start commentating on the players as they're doing stuff, you immediately slip into football commentator voice, which is, and it's Smith now, out wide to Morgan. Morgan forward to Hall, and Hall, and he's done it. Oh! You can't help but go a bit Peter Brackley, a bit more, yeah.
So, yeah, Joe Biden won the election. I'm quite happy about this.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think, broadly speaking, everybody is happy about this, and those who aren't happy about it are not listening to this show.
But my favourite thing about Trump winning the election, and this is a very crass thing for me to be my favourite thing.
I mean, is it the fact that it's going to be like better rights for gay and trans people, Mike? Is it that abortion rights are more likely to be secure for millions of women across America, Mike?
Closing all those concentration camps, things like that. No, that's not what's on top of my list. What's on the top of my list was the news story from ABC that said there were fireworks in Britain when Joe Biden was announced as the winner of the election. It's like, there were.
Yes, that is.
It was also the weekend of Guy Fawkes night.
It absolutely correlated with that, yes.
And they're like, the British are setting off fireworks because they're so happy about Joe Biden. Kind of.
To be fair, the first firework I heard that night came moments after the announcement. Like, with enough time for somebody to go on, do you know what? I've got some fireworks outside ready for bonfire night, and run out and go and light them.
Yeah.
Yes, although the announcement at UK time came at 6:30 in the evening, which is about the time you'd start your fireworks display as well.
It is also about the time that you'd be on the doorstep of our friends as they opened a bottle of champagne and poured it into glasses that we were holding at a social distance in order to celebrate. We did the whole watching CNN for 4 days straight, every waking moment thing. We got as invested as any right-thinking person looking at what is very clearly a pivotal moment in time, generally.
When you say right thinking there, you don't mean right thinking, you mean correct thinking.
Correct thinking, not right-leaning. Although, to be honest, even people who were right-leaning should have been looking at Trump and saying, I don't want to back this guy. Like, there are skeptics in America, even ones who are involved in running skeptical magazines, who it isn't clear that they weren't voting for Trump, despite the fact that Trump is a climate change denier and a anti-vaxxer and a 9/11 truther and the birther.
The birther, yeah.
You have people in America saying, well, I'm a classical liberal, and that's because I'm anti-woke and anti-progressive, and that's why I look at Trump and say, he's my man. So right thinkers, even people on the right-leaning side of the spectrum, should still look at this absolute buffoon and say, if he is representing us, I'd no longer want to be us. Other than that, Nicola has taken on Sleepy Joe as a term of affection, And so when he gave a speech, Nicola was watching going, oh, Sleepy Joe. Oh, I love him, Sleepy Joe.
Reclaim it. That's fine.
Oh, yeah.
You're allowed to. That's okay.
The thing is, that's because, Nicola's allowed to reclaim it because she's one of the sleepy community. It's like you and I, we aren't allowed to, but It's her word to use.
Are you allowed to refer to other people? Oh, look, he's such a Sleepy Joe.
Yeah. Only a sleepy person can call another sleepy person a sleepy person. That's how that works.
But it's very different to a Sloppy Joe. That's a totally different, very minor difference in the spelling, vastly different concept between a Sleepy Joe and a Sloppy Joe.
And a Slippy Joe.
Entirely different thing again. This is true.
And a Slappy Joe, which is one of the things he was accused of during the presidential campaign.
We live in strange times where falsehoods repeated often enough are taken to be the same thing as the truth, where everyone is an armchair expert in something while simultaneously claiming that people are tired of people being experts, where people who are software engineers or accountants think they know more about physics or how buildings collapse or how cancer works or the realities of climate change or whatever, and that their polymath-like genius has overturned decades of scientific understanding in favor of what they reckon. Because scientists are incompetent, or they're all in on it, or they're all paid off, or whatever, some fucking reason. And these people are rightly dismissed as cranks. They overestimate their own knowledge and ability and underestimate the same in experts who study a particular field. Like, no, Steve, you haven't invented a perpetual motion machine out of magnets. You haven't proved that the Earth is flat. The deep state isn't holding you back. You just have a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts and are carrying a load of motivated reasoning.
Have you been getting my emails since I took over as editor of the Skeptic magazine? Because those sound incredibly familiar. Right down to the chap who said, so I'm not saying that climate change isn't happening. What I'm saying is you have to be very skeptical of anybody who's heading for a carbon neutral target, because that's impossible. What instead we should be doing is dimming the sun.
Good. Yeah. That's much easier than trying to reduce carbon emissions with a goal of kind of heading towards carbon neutral, is to actually snuff out the sun.
Yeah, I mean, you can either lobby governments and oil companies to stop exploration production and to turn towards renewable energy, or you can dim a star. one or the other. Or both. Why not both?
Well, if you've got lots of irons in the fire, it's the way to tackle climate change is to have, lots of different simultaneous approaches, I feel.
Yeah, and also nuclear energy, which is a lot of ions in the fire.
I indicated that I was about to speak then, and Marsh had his pun ready. He just because straight on through.
There was anything you were going to say after that, Alice. I couldn't have then gone back to that ions in the fire. So I could tell you were going to say something, but I thought I'll slip this in, and then you can crack on.
I can't remember what I was going to say now. No, I can. At what point is the sun being dimmed? At the sun or at the Earth?
I haven't asked for that clarification yet. I'm sort of worried to ask for it.
If it's at the sun, that affects the entire solar system.
Yeah, but there's nobody else in the solar system apart from that water that's on the moon.
and the water on Europa. Be fair, Marsh, be fair. And possibly the life on Venus. We haven't quite ruled that out yet.
They're miles away.
But I would lean towards a big pair of Polaroid sunglasses around the whole planet. That would be the way I would go. Try and go with that to try and dim the sun instead of putting
line up the bridge of the sunglasses with the North Pole where it's like far away from the equator.
Instead of everyone wears a piece of Polaroid over their eyes, you put one bit of Polaroid over the whole planet, and then no one has to wear sunglasses.
This is a silly solution, Mike, because what you're proposing is sort of wrapping the entire planet like it's a football at Christmas, which are notoriously difficult to wrap a spherical object anyway. You get problems at the corners. What you need instead is to just work out a distance between us and the sun and just whack a lens there.
Right.
But it would have to be one that moves.
Yeah, it would have to be in a solar synchronous orbit, synchronized to our orbit. But again, it's either that or get people to recycle a bit more and to switch to renewable energy. So in fairness, he's probably got a point. We probably should be doing the first of those things because the second of those is proving to be very, very difficult.
Mike had a story.
But in the middle of all this, you've got me. I'm a software engineer challenging decades of scientific understanding because I've got a bee in my reductionist bonnet about placebos. And I'm aware that I look an awful lot like a crank with respect to this. And it's one of the reasons I've been reluctant to discuss it more widely than in the context of my own podcast.
Just be clear, this subject is not what makes you look like a crank. This just
That's
fits
fair.
the broader crank profile you've been building up throughout your life.
But I get invitations to talk about placebos from various skeptics in the pub groups or other podcasts or whatever, and I've never accepted one. I've never gone to do that. Although I'm persuaded in myself that I'm right about this, I'm not persuaded enough that I think I should be pushing the idea onto other people, partly because I know I look an awful lot like a crank here. But at least on this podcast, I can be straight with our listeners and go, I know I look an awful lot like a crank here. I don't know that I'm right about it. And that's harder to do for an audience of strangers who, don't know me and, what I'm like about this. So the imposter syndrome looms large here. Although I do find it very comforting when I talk to scientists, because occasionally I'll talk to a scientist, I'll talk to a medic or someone working in research, and they'll email me or they'll, pull me to one side at QED or something and say that they've heard my argument about placebo effects and they find them compelling, especially if there's someone who said, yeah, I've also gone and read the same studies that you have, and I think your criticisms are fair. And that's really reassuring. And so if you're one of those folks who has emailed me or spoken to me about that and, said, yeah, Mike, I think you're right. Well, thanks for that. Actually means a lot. Because as I say, massive imposter syndrome about this whole fucking placebo bit. And that vote of confidence really helps with that. Conversely, I do continue to look out for things which challenge my views on placebo effects. And I look out for arguments or evidence to the contrary in case I'm wrong. Because if I find such evidence, I then have to come on air that week and say, sorry, folks, turns out I was talking bollocks. Or more realistically, find a reason to dismiss it because of my motivated reasoning. That's more practically what's actually going to happen when that happens, but I'd like to think I'd do the former.
It's easier that way, though, isn't it?
For new listeners who aren't aware, and I don't want to overlabor this because I've talked about this a lot on the show, but for new listeners who aren't aware, I don't believe that the placebo effect exists. I don't think it's a real thing. I don't, capital T definite article, the placebo effect. I don't think that's a real thing. What you have, rather, in the placebo arm of a clinical trial is a huge bucket of uncontrolled or non-specific effects and biases which can't really be effectively teased apart. This isn't a single effect. It's not about if you believe you're going to get better, then you're going to get better, which is the way placebo effect is often characterized, especially by a lay audience. A lot of these non-specific effects are totally mundane and boring, like people who were just going to get better anyway, or statistical regression, or they were taking aspirin and didn't tell the clinicians that actually they were taking aspirin, and so there was an active intervention in there that wasn't recorded. And long-time listeners will have heard all of these arguments before. But my ongoing dive into the primary literature on placebo effects has introduced some nuance into that view that I didn't have when I first started looking at this. So I still believe that if you take that bucket of statistical effects and biases and start to account for those effects, like if we were able to measure regression to the mean independently and subtract that, if we were able to measure bias independently and subtract that, once you've accounted for everything, I don't think there's any placebo effect left. Once all the known effects are accounted for, I don't think there's anything left in that bucket to be the kind of true mind over matter placebo effect that people think is there.
It's hard as well because a lot of people, certainly in academic or medical communities, would hear you say, I don't believe the placebo effect exists, and think you're being overly bold in that claim, because to them, the placebo effect often, and there are plenty of academic and medical researchers who believe the placebo effect is this capital T placebo effect.
Yeah.
But there are many, many more who see it for what it is, which is a word that describes lots of biases and how we account for lots of biases. So your view of what that is aligns with what it really is. Just there's an awful lot of people that believe that the placebo effect is some magical unknown thing that cures you from illnesses if you believe hard enough. And that's the thing that you don't think that exists, because of course it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Now, there are plausible mechanisms for purely psychological stimuli having real physiological effects. That there are ways that can happen.
Yeah, and you talked about some of those before on the show as well.
Yeah. I had a listener message me on Twitter recently asking about a time when they were a kid and their parents had convinced them that sitting on a brown paper bag would get rid of their travel sickness. And it did. It worked. If they were sitting on the brown paper bag, then, they could deal with the travel sickness. It was okay. And so how could that work? Was that a placebo effect? But there isn't a placebo effect. Where's the bias in that? Where's the data? And I wrote back to them and said it's because psychological stimuli can have physiological effects in some cases. Pain and nausea are particularly susceptible to this.
Nausea is a great example, yeah.
Yeah, or there was a snake in the brown paper bag and they were just too preoccupied with not being bitten by a snake to worry about the fact they were traveling.
I'm increasingly getting travel sickness at the minute.
You're not moving.
I think it's because I've not fucking been anywhere in so many months that now when I get in a car, my body's all confused and I get really car sick suddenly out of nowhere.
But if you're feeling nauseated by travel sickness, then just the reassurance that you're not going to be sick because you're sitting on the magic bag might calm you down enough that you can more easily tolerate the sensation of nausea. And maybe the nausea is totally the same, but because you're in a different mood, you can tolerate it better. And so it is subjectively less difficult an experience for you. That isn't going to work with everything, though. There is a very narrow range of situations where that sort of thing will work, and it mostly is pain and nausea. There was also the time we talked about on air about the guy who overdosed on placebos and his blood pressure was all over the place. And we were like, yeah, he was having a panic attack. That's fine. This idea that a psychological intervention can't have a physiological effect seems to negate the existence of the brain, which is a very clear relationship between the mind and the body. It's the direct link, if you want to look at it that way. So I'm always on the lookout for things that might be evidence to the contrary of my position, if only so I can dismiss it out of hand with motivated reasoning, but maybe it'll persuade me. I don't know. I'd like to think the latter. So I was interested in an article that I saw on Science-Based Medicine, which was titled Surgery, the Ultimate Placebo. Placebo effects and surgery were one of the first topics that we actually talked about when I started to look at the literature supporting a real powerful placebo effect in earnest on the show, mostly because of the very popular claim that fake placebo surgery, where you cut somebody open and then don't do an operation, works as well as the real thing.
Yeah, the arthroscopic knee surgery stuff.
Arthroscopic knee surgery is the example that is always cited for this. And this demonstrates the amazing power of placebo. Surgery works even when you fake it. Believing you have had the operation works as well as having had the operation. And this claim crops up. I've seen it in The Guardian. QI tweet about it. It shows up in Bad Science. I think it was at 9 Lessons. Michael Mosley talked about it for the BBC on the Horizon documentary he did on placebos. It's a very, very common claim. And the specific surgery is always that arthroscopic surgery for osteoarthritis of the knee study. It's always that one that's cited. And my objection to that is when a treatment has the same effect as placebo, we don't praise the placebo, we discard the treatment. It means the treatment doesn't work.
That's why placebo controlling exists. That's why we placebo control clinical trials.
Yeah, it's what it's for.
Yeah, and you've had people who are experts in that particular, in like the knee joint surgery area, osteoarthritis area, actually confirm that they don't do that particular intervention anymore because it was no better than placebo.
Yeah, well, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated than that, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So I was interested to see this article on Science-Based Medicine saying surgery is the ultimate placebo. And it was an article written by Harriet Hall, and Harriet Hall's brilliant. We had her at QED. She was a great speaker. She's written good stuff on placebos in the past. I think she is skeptical of a real powerful placebo effect as well. And she was talking in this article about an Australian surgeon and skeptic called Ian Harris. And Ian Harris has been lecturing recently about the paucity of evidence and consequential unscientific rationalization of the field of surgery. So, of course, he talks about the study on osteoarthritis of the knee and concludes, much to my delight, that what this paper says is that the surgery is a waste of time. This surgery doesn't work. And we've talked about this on the show a few times, and, you know, people write in and say, yes, I remember when that study came out and it was a bombshell in the community at the time. It was a huge deal for us, etc. And as you say, Marsh, they'll say, you know, and we don't do that operation anymore. But Ian Harris disagrees with that. In a lecture on the topic that is published on YouTube that I watched the other day, he pointed out that while those surgeries are declining in Australia as a whole, and of course he's an Australian surgeon, so he's talking about Australia, those arthroscopic surgeries are declining in Australia as a whole and in New South Wales specifically, but in South Australia, they're actually on the increase and they're performing more of those operations than they ever have before. And it turns out this arthroscopic surgery is one of the most common orthopedic surgeries performed in the world. And it has reduced in some areas since this data came out. And this data is quite old now. It's about 10 years old now, this data. But it has reduced, but it hasn't, you know, been eliminated by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, Harris doesn't stop at osteoarthritis of the knee. He goes on to cite several more examples of cases where surgical interventions actually don't work any better than placebos, which I thought was really fascinating. He started off with a study that was, starting in 1939, there was this idea of the development of an arterial ligation as a surgical intervention for angina. So angina is a kind of chest pain that's caused by reduced blood flow to the heart. And in 1939, there was an Italian surgeon named Fieschi who suggested that you might be able to treat angina by tying off the internal mammary artery, which is an artery within the chest. Because if you tie that artery off, then the blood won't flow through that artery anymore. Where's it going to go instead? It's going to go to the heart. And so you get more blood flow to the heart because the blood that was going to the mammary artery is now going into the heart instead.
Why don't you just carry that on? Just cut off all the arteries. Just cut them off. Short circuit the heart so it just loops back on itself.
And they tried this, and patients said they got better. They said that their angina was better. So they kept doing that operation for the next 20 years. And on the basis of that, well, I reckon it should work. It's kind of plausible. If you tie that off, then the blood will go somewhere else, and this is caused by lack of blood, so this should fix it. On the basis of, I reckon it should work, 20 years worth of surgeries were done. And patients saying, yeah, I think I feel better. 20 years worth of surgeries were done.
Yeah.
And they performed this surgery around the world for 2 decades as a treatment for angina until the late 50s, early 60s, when someone thought, do you think maybe we should do a controlled trial on this? Is that maybe an idea? Is that maybe something that might be a sensible thing to do? And so I went and dug out this paper. This is one of a few that were conducted around that time. This paper was titled Comparison of Internal Mammary Arterial Ligation and Sham Operation for Angina Pectoris. And it was published by the American Journal of Cardiology in 1960. In this paper, 18 patients, so really, really small numbers, 18 patients were randomized into 2 groups. Both groups had surgery, but in one group, the surgeon did not tie off the artery. They got down and said, there it is, lads, and then did nothing. They just finished up and closed up. The patients were blinded, their cardiologists were blinded, etc. And what they found, this is from the conclusion of the paper, a sham operation was compared to the ligation of the internal mammary arteries in patients with angina pectoris. Patient improvement was identical. So the sham operation where you didn't tie anything off recorded exactly the same level of improvement in patients as if you actually tied it off.
Wow, so sham surgery works there as well.
So in other words, the operation is a waste of time, but it's more than a waste of time, right? Because you've cut somebody open.
Yeah.
Which carries with it a risk of infection, complications, someone leaving a cotton swab in you by mistake.
Yeah, there'll be a non-zero number of people whose lives were materially harmed by having had that surgery.
Or even lost.
Yes, yeah.
People die on the operating table. It happens a lot.
I would throw death into a material harm to your life.
You think?
Yeah.
It's in the Venn diagram.
It's in there.
It is, yeah. It's definitely a subset of material harm. So what you've done is you've exposed the patient to significant risk for no medical benefit. You've exposed them to risk with no benefit for them whatsoever, which in my book is as unethical as you can get as a medical practice. There was another surgical intervention. This one was an awful lot more recent. This was from BBC News in 2009. So this is a news story that I found on BBC News. It said scientists are testing a radical new theory that multiple sclerosis, MS, is caused by blockages in the veins that drain the brain. The University of Buffalo team are intrigued by the work of an Italian researcher, Dr. Paolo Zamboni, who claims that 90% of MS is caused by narrow veins. So Paolo Zamboni it's not like he's dead, is an Italian doctor, and he had this idea. Apparently, according to Ian Harris, his wife had MS, and so that's one of the reasons why he was interested in the field. He had this idea that MS was caused by blockages in the veins in the neck. These blockages prevent blood from draining from the brain properly, which means deposits are left in the brain, which causes the symptoms we recognize as MS. And he called this CCSVI, which is chronic cerebrospinal venous insufficiency. Literally, the veins in the neck are not sufficient. They're not wide enough. And so he developed a technique to widen the veins in the neck using balloon dilation. So you surgically insert a balloon into the jugular vein and you inflate it to dilate the vein on the reasoning that you make that vein wider, it drains better and thus alleviates the symptoms of MS, like a kind of surgical Dynarod.
Alice, you have a grimace.
I don't like the idea of doing surgery to jugular veins if you can avoid it.
And this operation was performed on many, many patients with MS, with many as a result of the coverage from people like BBC News demanding to have the surgery, going to the doctors and demanding, I want this surgery. CBC News out of Canada, they have a story that I found from 2010 about MS patients protesting at Parliament Square, demanding access to the Zamboni technique.
Which makes sense, because obviously if you've got MS and obviously it's incredibly debilitating and scary and things like that, and if there is this technique out there that people are saying works, it makes sense that some people are going to start demanding it.
And speakers at the protest included people who had had the procedure and said, I've been fixed by this procedure, quote unquote fixed by this procedure. And as a result of those protests, the Canadian government funded a 5.5 million Canadian dollar placebo-controlled trial on the Zamboni technique, which was conducted at the University of British Columbia. That was published in 2018 in the journal Neurology, and it was titled Safety and Efficacy of Venoplasty in MS, a randomized double-blind sham-controlled phase 2 trial. 104 patients with MS were randomized into 2 groups. Both groups were given surgery, but one group had the balloon inserted into the vein and inflated, and the other just had the catheter inserted, but they didn't insert and inflate a balloon. So nice and straightforward comparison there. We popped a balloon in and blew it up, or we didn't, and everything else was the same. After 48 weeks of follow-up, which is obviously, is a long time, but you want to do this properly, they found that there was absolutely no difference between the 2 groups on either physical symptoms with a p-value of 0.95, so that's a long way from significance, or there was no difference between the groups on mental symptoms either, with a p-value of 0.55. And the conclusion in that paper was, our data do not support the continued use of venoplasty of extracranial, jugular, and or azygous. Alice, help me out here. Azygous, good. I was right. I knew that. Venous narrowing to improve patient-reported outcomes, chronic MS symptoms, or the disease course of MS. And so this was to great fanfare in 2009. We've cured MS, and then a decade later, it's like, no, we didn't. And Zamboni is on record now of going, yeah, I think maybe it was nonsense. Although I found conflicting articles. I've found stuff from like the end of 2017 of him going, yeah, I think maybe it's nonsense. But other stuff saying he's sticking by his guns. And, it's hard to know. There's several more very similar examples that Harris cites in his lecture, including the trial on osteoarthritis of the knee that we've talked about. So were those 3 cherries picked? What does that actually say about the evidence for surgical interventions in general? Well, right now, of course, it says very little. What we need is a systematic review, which, of course, has been done. So this was published by the British Medical Journal in 2014 and was titled Use of Placebo Controls in the Evaluation of Surgery, a Systematic Review. So 53 studies were identified from the Cochrane database, Medline or Embase, that sort of stuff, the kind of big medical databases. And they looked specifically for studies that included a surgical arm and a placebo arm. And of those studies identified, 51% of them showed no effect above placebo for the surgical intervention. So half of all studies that look at a surgery compared to placebo find that there is no difference from placebo. And these are usually trivial interventions, right? Like an endoscopy or whatever. But nevertheless, half of all papers comparing a placebo to a surgical intervention show that the surgery does not work. And I think that's a huge finding, especially for an area of medicine which is largely considered to be exempt from the needs to do placebo-controlled trials, because surgeons have this idea of, well, it should work, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
And when I do it, my patients feel better, and so it's fine.
But I wonder how much that comes from kind of a historic view of surgery, when surgery was a bit more rough and ready, when it was like you're cutting off legs, you're not going in and stitching together specific veins in a specific tiny little area using a keyhole technique. When it was something big, like this person has gangrene, I've cut his leg off, he no longer has gangrene or a leg.
Or even like this patient has unbearable pain, arthritic pain in their left knee. Let's cut the leg off above the knee and the pain has gone away.
Yeah.
Fix the problem.
So the more rudimentary and rustic surgery, which obviously it started out as all medical inventions did, but it seems, but you'd imagine it's very easy to look at those very rustic and rudimentary interventions getting more progressively complicated over time and say, well, this is just basically mechanics rather than biochemistry and that kind of thing. Whereas obviously more pharmacological things have always been very biochemical in nature.
Well, what I thought was really interesting, and this is where I thought Ian Harris had a really good perspective here, is that, so Ian Harris is an orthopedic surgeon, that's his job. And when he challenges his colleagues with data like this, the way he characterizes them is he says they behave exactly the same way dowsers do. They come up with some post hoc rationalization as to why that data doesn't count to what they're doing, and they should be able to continue doing what they're doing anyway. Whereas dowsers might invoke things like sunspots or whatever to explain why they can't perform under test conditions, surgeons will invoke things like the parachute analogy. You don't need to do a controlled trial to know this surgery works any more than you need a controlled trial to see if a parachute works. We know because our patients get better. We know because we see it work. Every day I see this work. And that is exactly what you hear from dowsers, from homeopaths, from chiropractors, from everyone operating in it. And I'm not saying that surgery is an out-and-out pseudoscience here.
No, you're definitely saying surgery's woo. You've been radicalized, Mike. You've gone off the deep end. It had to happen eventually.
But doctors are also going to have their pet treatments and pet treatment options for certain symptoms as they present, because they will have experienced different things with all the previous patients they've seen and experienced different conditions in different ways. For example, I've had a rash in my hairline for the last year or so, and I've seen 3 different doctors about it, and they offered completely different solutions every time. One of them gave me a medicated shampoo to use. One of them gave me a really thick ointment to use. One of them did a test of my immune system to see if it was a problem with my immune system. And then the most recent doctor I saw gave me this amazing little ointment that has cleared it up entirely. And yet, same problem, 3 different doctors, 3 different solutions and combinations of solution, because they've all encountered different things that work with different patients in the past, and they'll use the thing that worked the last time they saw this sort of condition.
Yeah, you should have seen a surgeon. She'd have cut your head off. Job done. No more rash.
Is it an interesting aside here, actually? Ian Harris also references a paper that looked at the parachute analogy specifically. So the parachute analogy is very frequently cited by surgeons as, I don't need to do a controlled trial on this any more than you need to do a controlled trial on a parachute because we know it works. But there's this paper that was titled, Most Medical Practices Are Not Parachutes, a citation analysis of practices felt by biomedical authors to be analogous to parachutes. And it was published by the Canadian Medical Association in 2018. In it, the authors looked at papers which cite the parachute analogy as a justification as to why an RCT doesn't need to be done. Actually, more specifically, they look at papers that cite a joke article from the BMJ. So the BMJ, on April Fool's Day a few years ago, the BMJ put out an article which was a systematic review on the efficacy of parachutes, which concluded there's no data, so we can't draw any conclusions at all. And it was a joke article.
Yeah. Was it definitely April Fool's? I know they do that at Christmas as well, don't they? They put out bullshit.
It might have been a Christmas one as well. It might, may well have been Christmas. But this systematic review looked at papers that had cited that to say, and our intervention is like a parachute, we don't need to do an RCT, and had cited that paper. But anyway, of the papers that cited the joke article, the authors then looked for which of those interventions had subsequently had a randomized control trial done. So in early paper, we don't need to do an RCT on this. How many of those actually had an RCT later on? And they found that only 27% of papers who claim they don't need an RCT actually passed an RCT later. The rest of them either failed the RCT, or the data was inconclusive, or had mixed results, or the trial was aborted, or the trial is still ongoing. Only 27% of those papers who went on to have an RCT had a successful RCT.
I'd like to think of the ones where the trial was aborted, they definitely should not have been doing an RCT. Like this was definitely the equivalent of RCTs for parachutes. It's like, oh no, like he just splat. Okay, we should never have done this. This wasn't worth the rhetoric.
So I thought that was really interesting finding. Anyway, so okay, maybe the data says that this surgery doesn't work, but if you've exhausted all non-surgical options, then what option have we got? We'll just do the surgical option anyway. Yeah, we tried everything else. Let's try the surgery. Or maybe the data says it doesn't work, but my patients say they want the procedure, so I'm going to give it to them. Those are also arguments that are put forward by surgeons as a reason to continue doing the surgery that we know doesn't work.
There is also a case for, and I'm not sure many surgeons will think about it this way, but there is also a case for if you've never bothered doing a study in your patients, you have a lot of patients who say, well, I had this for something else and it seems to have cured this problem. there might be a case for maybe we should do a study in this because people are reporting that it does actually have an effect for them and it does help them.
Yeah, and oddly, that's a position that Ian Harris advocates for. He said instead of doing surgeries that, where we don't have any data, instead of continuing to do them, why don't we just start doing trials instead? Because if the option is do a trial or do the surgery, okay, if you're doing a trial, then half your patients are subjected to less risk because they would have been given the surgery and now they're being given a sham surgery. So they're actually undergoing less risk than the other ones because you're doing less. And you get to find out the answer as to whether this works and save countless lives later.
And then potentially make available a treatment that reliably works to a larger proportion of patients. Or move on to the alternative and put more time and money into researching alternatives that may then improve patient success later.
Yeah, and obviously if it works, you go back through your placebo and give them that treatment.
Yeah, and that's happened. That's happened with, there was a treatment for emphysema where someone had this. So emphysema is where the sacs in the lung are damaged or collapse and they end up leaving voids in the lung. So even when you fully breathed out, there's still a pocket of air left in the lung that you can't expel. And that obviously that's very quickly depleted of oxygen. And so when you breathe in fresh air, it doesn't replace this kind of dead air, this stale air that's caught in your lung. And so it reduces your blood oxygenation, so you end up being tired and easily exhausted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they had this idea of you cut out the section of dead lung. And Ian Harris was like, I don't know what on earth made them think that would work. You're struggling to breathe, so let's cut a piece of your lung out. What? It
does seem counterintuitive.
It does seem oddly counterintuitive. But this was very widely done as an operation for emphysema. And it was the US Medicare system said, we're not sure this works. So what we're going to do is we will fund it as long as it is part of a trial. And they did a trial and it didn't work. And this is still very new from what I understand, because that's the way Ian Harris characterizes what happened in his lecture. But actually, if you go to the NICE website and the MHRA website, they still recommend this surgery as a treatment for emphysema, even though from what Ian Harris has said, and I didn't check the citation on this one, it wasn't one that, I just picked a few to talk about. It wasn't one that I looked into in detail. So I don't know what the real story is on that. But it's certainly the case that the Medicare system said, we're not doing the surgery until it's part of a trial. Whether the trial proved that it was right or wrong, it's kind of irrelevant. The point is that we can fund these surgeries by doing them as part of trials so we can find out whether they work or not. So maybe all the non-surgical interventions failed. Maybe that's the case, but that doesn't actually change anything about the surgical intervention. The fact that all non-surgical interventions failed doesn't mean that the surgery is any more likely to work, especially the surgery that we've already tried and we know actually doesn't work. Maybe patients are coming to you demanding that you operate on their arthritic knee, and maybe they'll stop demanding that you operate on their arthritic knee when you say, actually, that operation doesn't work. Maybe they'll demand it anyway, and then you've got to look into that. You've got to figure out how you feel about that, actually. But if you tell a patient that we've looked into this and this surgery is going to have no benefit for you, and I think an awful lot of patients will go, okay, well, maybe I don't want that surgery. Maybe they will, maybe they'll continue, maybe they won't believe you, but it is still on you as a surgeon to consider the ethics of performing an operation that we know to be ineffective on a patient demanding it when you know that there are significant risks involved.
The kids these days have their own fake Instagram accounts that they call Finsta.
Oh, is that what they call it?
Yeah, it's called a Finsta.
Wasn't Finsta the surname of Chucky from the Rugrats?
Well, I mean, it's not spelt with an ER, obviously, because it's short for Instagram, so it's a Finsta.
I still like to think it came first from the Rugrats and was retrofit to Instagram.
I'm not sure people who have Finstas would have grown up watching the Rugrats.
You know who the Rugrats are.
I'm not the age group that has a Finsta. I'm much older than the age group that has a Finsta. This is the younger kids.
I see.
Thing. Then this is like a place for them to share all the silly things with their nearest and dearest, keeping their real Instagram all polished and perfect, and having the silly stuff just for their select few close friends. So recently, I made myself sort of a Finsta. I've talked on the show before about how my Instagram is my happy place. I've carefully curated the people I follow to make sure that I mostly see things that bring me joy. But I've realised more and more recently, as we discussed on the show recently, that more and more woo is creeping onto Instagram. I found some stories there before that I've talked about on the show, and I'm sure there's so much more that I'm missing, but I don't want to clutter up my nice, happy Instagram with woo that makes me grumpy, so I decided to set up a second account to follow the woo accounts on.
Makes sense.
Winster?
Yeah, that's how that works. It's what Churchill was named after.
It was, yeah. Well, it's the other way around. The Winster is named after Churchill. It's just retrofitted to Instagram. Can you have a Winster Finster? You've got a Winster Finster.
Well, it is, yeah. It's still a Finster because I'm using a pseudonym on it, obviously, because if you Google me, all these skeptical things come up. And for some people with woo accounts, they are private accounts that you have to request to follow them. And I don't want to request. I mean, most of them aren't going to Google who requests them, but if they Google me, then they're going to find out that I'm anti-woo. So
you're going to have to call a Finster that's about woo a Winster, because if you called it a woo Finster, it would look like woof Insta, which is a whole other thing. Whole other thing that already exists.
So I first made it a few months ago because Lana had shared with me a post from a local hair salon that had put signs in their window proclaiming to be anti-mask and saying that they didn't want customers coming inside wearing a mask because they wanted to have this little safe space where you didn't have to think about COVID, where COVID wasn't real.
It's the opposite of a safe space. We wanted an unsafe space.
A dangerous space. This salon is a dangerous space. We're going to run with scissors. We're going to fall over. It's a terrible, and we're not going to sweep up.
Their post went viral on Reddit and then the local media, and they quickly locked down their Instagram account. Luckily, I'd gone to their account to read more, and I'd already created my Winster. I'm going to stick with it. And I requested to follow them the moment that they went private, so they accepted pretty quickly. And I've been able to watch with some horror as they then refused to go into lockdown despite being ordered to shut by the local council some weeks ago, and are still taking bookings even now.
Wow.
So I thought this episode I'd talk about some of the other woo types that are using Instagram to really proliferate dangerous ideas, and very successfully too. One of the other accounts I'm following on my Winster is called Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown. These are the second reason that I created the account, because they too were creeping into my main Instagram feed, luckily from gym goer friends in Liverpool who found their posts to be really problematic, but criticised them by sharing their posts to their own timelines and therefore helping spread the messaging wider.
Yeah. And just be clear, in case you're not aware, Mike, this isn't lots of Scouse Jameses.
I had assumed it was like Project Steve, where it was just like we found lots and lots of people called James who think lockdown is a bad idea.
Yep.
Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown have 14.9 thousand followers on Instagram. Their first post was on the 12th of October, the day it was announced that Liverpool would go into Tier 3 local restrictions 2 days later. And at the time, the ruling was that all bars should shut unless they were able to convert into restaurants. No social mixing was allowed indoors or outdoors, apart from in wide open spaces like parks. Wedding receptions were banned. Travel was to be kept to essential only.
I thought it was really interesting because Liverpool went into Tier 3 lockdown. And of course, on the COVID app, we had a big red banner that said, you are in an area which has gone into Tier 3 lockdown. And then when we went into national lockdown, which is effectively a Tier 4, it's like more severe than the Tier 3. It's now gone to a nice calm grey thing going, you're in line with the national standards.
I thought that as well. And I thought, that's a relief.
Don't you worry about it. And it's like, no, this should be a darker red, a scarier red now than it actually was. How are you guys enjoying the COVID app? Is that working out for you?
Well, it fucking locked me down for 2 weeks. So I'm not totally thrilled. I've literally only just come out of my self-isolation.
Yeah, because you walked past someone.
Even though you had a test and tested negative in that time.
In the meantime, I did have a test and tested negative. I input the negative test into the app and the app says to continue to isolate, which obviously I did. And I understand why it does. There's reasons why if you get a test in the first few days of exposure, you might not have high enough viral load for it to be recognised by the test. And it is responsible to self-isolate if you've been exposed to the virus. But bloody frustrating when I've only just got back into the lab to get some stuff done, and I've only got a few weeks left before Christmas, and I want to try and get some stuff done, and then I get locked down for 2 weeks. But
yeah. We did have a listener write in and ask me about something on the COVID app, actually saying what's the current thinking on the effectiveness of Bluetooth. as the way to do the exchange on the COVID app, because it's got a much longer range than you need for that. And one of the ways they're doing that is they're seeing how attenuated the signal is. So if you're closer to someone, you get a stronger Bluetooth signal, in which you can measure like in decibels.
Mm-hmm.
You get a stronger Bluetooth signal. And if they're further away, you get a weaker Bluetooth signal. And they're doing it like that. It's not a perfect measure, because like if it's in your pocket, it's going to be attenuated by that as well, or depending on which pocket you've got on, etc. But that's the way that they're kind of trying to estimate the distance between somebody, is by looking at how attenuated the Bluetooth signal is. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative, which is just, everyone with 100 meters of you who has COVID has de facto infected you, and we lock down half the planet at once.
Yeah.
Although my exposure was in a massive furniture store where I was masked the entire time and never went even closer than like 6 feet from somebody, but I still got in lockdown. But I stayed inside because it's the right thing to do, even though I knew that scientifically my exposure risk was virtually zero. Like I didn't get sick, I didn't have the virus, like I tested negative, but it's still the right thing to do, even if it seems confusing. So everything closed in terms of bars. You weren't supposed to socialize indoors or outdoors. You weren't supposed to have wedding receptions. You were supposed to only travel if it was essential. However, for Tier 3 regulations, closures of leisure centres, gyms, arts venues, and some other facilities were at the discretion of the local authority. So no guidance was given by the UK government, which meant Liverpool ordered its gyms to shut when they entered Tier 3 restrictions. So Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown sprung up on Instagram and started posting things like this first post where they say, "Stay fit, stay healthy, stay open," insisting we should keep gyms and fitness facilities open and allow people to stay fit and healthy, both physically and mentally. The second post was a person talking to camera on the same day, saying that they would refuse to shut, that their business would struggle, and calling for other gyms to do the same. And the early posts on their Instagram account were all around two claims. Firstly, that mental health is important and therefore access to gyms is important. And secondly, that there was no scientific evidence to support the idea that coronavirus is spreading in gyms.
Which sounds like one of those parachute studies. that, yes, there's no evidence that it's spreading specifically in gyms, but we do know it's spreading indoors in places where people are breathing a lot. And the more you're breathing and the heavier you're breathing, the more likely you are to contract it and to spread it there. And so you sort of get the sense that a gym is going to be a place where people are breathing out a lot and hard and sweating droplets.
Yeah, we may not have actively studied in gyms. To be honest, I didn't look at the science on transmission in gyms because it's not really relevant to the point that I want to make here. But if there isn't scientific evidence, if the scientific evidence says that large open spaces like gyms, as long as they're not overpopulated, is fine, then closing gyms might not be a great idea. But using that as an argument for it when you're actually talking about other things, which we'll come on to, is a bit underhanded. So the account very rapidly, and this is the main reason I don't want to talk about the science too much, is because the account very rapidly moved into classic anti-lockdown rallies and full conspiracy theory territory. So on the 13th of October, they announced the organisation of a mental health awareness rally, which was to be held on the 17th of October. It was held on the 17th of October. And as that rally happened, I saw photos and videos of lots of protesters packed in together in close proximity with no masks in sight. In fact, I'm going to send you some of the photos now so you can see just how many people were at that rally and just how few people were wearing masks, aka 0 people.
Yeah, that's not good. It's not good, is it? Makes me feel incredibly squeamish. And I know, I'm sure you're going to come to just how big some of those rallies have been, not just the Liverpool gyms against lockdown. I've seen a lot of stuff in like Manchester and London, and it's been Darren Nesbitt. I think I mentioned on a previous show that it's been Darren Nesbitt, but the latest march through Liverpool was someone holding a sign. There was a picture of it in one of the papers saying, "Stick your New World Order up your arse. We are the 99%," which are lyrics from Darren Nesbitt's songs. He's starting to get fan accounts walking the streets. Bless Dasnez and his diamond world.
So you both should have those photos now to have a look at and see how many people were at this first rally. It was, I don't know if you can estimate how many people are in that first photo.
It is a big old crowd, isn't it? It is a big old crowd.
Roughly a fuck ton.
So a big group of people. I've zoomed into this to look closer at the faces, and I genuinely can't see a single mask. And I haven't seen a single mask in any of the photos that they posted.
Mm.
So signs at this mental health awareness rally, including signs saying choose freedom, WWG1WGA.
Oh, where we go one, we go all.
Yeah, an abbreviation of that QAnon phrase. We do not consent, and Trump 2020.
Why not?
Which is nice.
Why not? This was just to be clear, this was in the UK, wasn't it?
This was in Liverpool.
This was around the corner.
On the 17th of October at a mental health awareness rally.
Now, just to be clear, most people who live in Liverpool don't get a vote in the US election.
No,
and I'd imagine most people in Liverpool would not be voting for Trump, given Liverpool's political allegiances by and large. That said, there was a recent football match at Goodison Park, Everton's ground, and a plane flew over the top with the banner saying Trump won the election, MAGA. And that flew over Goodison Park during a football match here in Liverpool. So what the fuck is going on?
So one of the gyms was issued a £1,000 fine on the same day that the group got coverage. This is the first day that the restrictions came into force, the 14th of October. They were issued a £1,000 fine on the same day. They got coverage from Sky, BBC, ITV and Channel 4. And I think this media coverage is important. This is the days before the rally where no one's wearing masks. And the coverage is broadly supportive. And this is for one important reason. Lancashire gyms didn't close. So you remember earlier I said that it was at the discretion of local authorities. And in that first wave, a number of regions were put onto Tier 3 regulations, all of them in the northwest, and including both Liverpool and Lancashire. Liverpool decided to close their gyms and Lancashire decided not to, which led to quite legitimate frustration that different places were under different instructions despite being in the same tier. So that week, Liverpool's local mayor, Joe Anderson, tweeted, Liverpool City Region has demanded immediate clarification on why Lancashire gyms are allowed to stay open and Liverpool's closed. Inconsistent mess. We now have Tier 3A and Tier 3B. Are gym users in Lancashire more safe than those in Liverpool Region? Hashtag COVID-19, hashtag shambles. And the local Hot Water Comedy Club organised some comedy events to raise money for gyms who are fined in solidarity. So the local community kind of rallied around the gyms and tried to support them.
As businesses rather than as conspiracy theorists.
Exactly. Very much as we don't understand why gyms are closing because of these claims that there's no scientific evidence that the virus transmits through gyms and that mental health is important and people should have access to fitness.
And because gyms in other parts of the country weren't closing, yeah.
Exactly. And then several days later, the Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown hosted this rally on the 17th where no one in the photos or videos I've seen were wearing masks and people were carrying conspiracy theory signs. 1 week later, they hosted another protest. Again, lots of people and no masks. And there was a film released on their Instagram account of a woman reading a poem she had written, which began, fear-based illusions is how they tell their lies, pumping out duplicated figures to increase the rise, death certificates falsified to add to the cause, shut the doors on your business, allow the economy to fall.
Oh, God, I can't. I thought this was as bad as it could get. And then you brought in shit poetry with crap rhyming schemes, which is one of the things I find most upsetting generally.
I did put that in just for you, Mosh.
It's like when you get on a fucking advert. It might as well have been recounted breathlessly over some acoustic music while we see slow motion footage of people like walking about their lives. Oh, God, I hate it so much.
And conspiracy theory poetry at that. And then the gyms reopened. Actually, they reopened the day before the second protest, which still went ahead.
Sensible.
Because it was never about that.
It wasn't about that.
What do you want? Gym's open. When do you want it? Yesterday.
But the tactics seem to have worked. They seem to have got the local authority to listen to them and reopen the gyms in line with what other Tier 3 regions were doing. And then it became clear that there would be a national lockdown. And this was announced on the 31st of October. And on November the 1st, the account shared a video of David Icke. followed by a link to a letter of non-compliance on the 2nd of November, which I forgot to check because I had too many things to talk about in the story, but I'm pretty sure that I looked at that letter of non-compliance at the time that they posted it, and it also used this weird Magna Carta thing that all the conspiracy theorists were using around that time to say, if you put a sign of the Magna Carta on your door, then the police aren't allowed to close you because it's a loophole of some sort.
Yeah, very freedom of the land kind of stuff.
Yeah. On the 5th, they held another protest, November the 5th, the day that lockdown began. Again, lots of people, no masks. And videos shared claiming that the police were harassing them. I watched the videos that they specifically shared. They actually show police standing in the middle of the crowd as protesters shout at them and film them. And the post is captioned, "Some officers at Merseyside Police are an absolute disgrace to the uniform," and claims that the police deliberately incited violence and singled out, harassed and bullied certain people, which might have been the case. I'm not saying I am pro-police at protests.
No, I'm pretty sure what you're saying is Blue Lives Matter, Alice. I can hear you loud and clear.
It might well have been the case that the police handled that protest badly, but what I am saying is the video attached to this claim is not evidence of that.
Yeah.
The video that they use when they say that is just police officers standing still in the middle of a crowd of people shouting at them. On the 7th, they held a Liberty rally against lockdown, which they advertised saying, "Come and join us to protest against the new national lockdown, troops brought to Liverpool and COVID-19 tyranny." Again, they shared videos of police officers, this time of a group of between 5 and 7 officers wearing face masks while handling a clearly non-compliant gentleman and being swarmed on by a very large number of protesters while using what I think is reasonable pushing force. They were pushing the protesters back because they were backed up against a riot van and clearly at threat of both violence and infection. And they were very obviously pushing the crowd back against being swarmed by these people. Again, I'm not saying that the police have not acted inappropriately in handling these protests, but in this video that the group have shared, I think that they showed remarkable restraint, as police officers absolutely must, when they were at quite clear threat. And towards the end of the video, the protesters start chanting, "Shame on you."
Mm. And just be clear, the thing that they're talking about there about COVID tyranny and troops on our street is the fact that Liverpool here in the UK was selected as the pilot for the mass testing programme where anybody in the city can be tested anytime they want, which to international listeners won't sound like much of a pilot programme and will sound much more like a functional testing programme in the sense that in Germany you were being stopped in the street to ask, "Do you fancy doing a test, by the way? Because we sort of need to know who's got it." Here for a long time, you could only get a test if you had been alerted on the app or called by the test and trace and had symptoms.
Yeah, and specifically had symptoms.
Yeah, because the advice was even if the app said you've got it, you don't need to go and get a test unless you also have symptoms, which obviously misses a lot of asymptomatic carriers. And so for this mass testing pilot, the government, it was said that the army was coming to run that. Now, I haven't seen the army anywhere, but the idea of Boris Johnson's Tory government sending the army into Liverpool quite understandably has the people of Liverpool, some people of Liverpool, a little bit nervous.
Which is a fair enough reaction.
Some bad optics on that, isn't there? There's you know, it's maybe not. And I love the way that governments like to use the army as just like, if the fire brigade goes on strike, they bring the army in.
Yeah.
We need lots of people to administer. Bring in the army. They're medically trained? Nah.
They're just our backup plan, aren't they?
Bring them in anyway.
Well, we're not fighting as many wars as we used to. You know, classically, it's been like best part of 80 years since there was a proper, serious, massive war we all got involved in.
What you need is a poster from the Home Office with a picture of a soldier going, his next job is as a COVID tester. He just doesn't know it yet.
Yeah, exactly. What you need is, you know, these soldiers, they're not fighting wars anymore. They're not doing anything. You need them. I think we should have mandatory public service where soldiers have to go and get a real job for a while to teach them some discipline. I'm joking. Before anybody shouts at me, I'm joking.
So on that day, the November the 7th protest, I'm aware I'm giving lots of dates. I'm trying to make distinctions between the different protests that there have been all under this Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown banner because the number is important to note. There were 2 people arrested. There were 7 antisocial behaviour dispersal notices given and 3 fines under coronavirus legislation. And it was reported that around 300 people were at the protest. On Sunday the 8th, The Liverpool Gyms Against Lockdown travelled to Manchester to support them in their Don't Stand By, Stand Up, Rise Up Manchester protest, which again in the videos they posted had lots of people and no masks. And as I say, I think the biggest issue with this really is the merging of legitimate issues, concerns around whether the measures imposed are fair, proportional and evidence-based are important to discuss, but then combining those with the heavy conspiracy messaging that this group is really helping to proliferate these ideas that are damaging and harmful.
And those are really difficult bedfellows, because we agree very strongly with one of those and disagree very strongly with the other one of those. And for the perspective of most people, those groups are fighting on the same side, and they're very much not.
Yeah, and it's always a difficult thing when there is deep uncertainty, as this unprecedented crisis has obviously kind of brought us a level of uncertainty that we've simply not had in our lives. Certainly our generation never had in our lives. That combined with what has been, by any definition, by any reasonable judgment, a comprehensive failure of communication from authorities throughout all of this, a failure of consistency, and also a failure to really tackle this in terms of getting a functional testing and tracing operation up. And the vacuum of uncertainty and the vacuum of leadership, into both those vacuums steps the conspiracy theorists, which is why someone like David Icke has emerged as a leader for a lot of people in this, because he's willing to say confidently and with certainty things when everything else is happening with uncertainty and a lack of confidence, even though the stuff he's saying is obviously complete bollocks.
Yeah. But of course, on Winster, it is not just COVID conspiracies we need to worry about. There is woo relating to just about every topic we've ever discussed on this show, all over Instagram. And we've also got Dr. Mark Hyman, a medical doctor who has 1.1 million followers and posts things like, for every 10% of your diet that comes from processed food, your risk of death goes up 14%. And also, you can suppress COVID-19 symptoms with breath, in an interview with our good friend Wim Hof, who believes cold exposure cures all ills.
I like that one about 10% of your food being processed increases your rate of death by 14%, because you don't have to go that high before you are 100% dead, because 14 is more than 10.
Yeah.
If half of your diet is, well, a bit over half, if it's like 6% of your diet is processed, you're dead. You've got like an 80-90% chance of death. Also, if you never eat a processed thing, you'll never die.
Mark Hyman has books available, including the 10-day detox diet, and offers courses on supporting your immune system and improving your sleep. He's a promoter of peganism, a diet that combines paleo and vegan.
Oh, that's not nice. That's a horrible word. I would only accept peganism if it meant you only ate peas.
Yeah.
And drank piss. If it's urine therapy and a very specific vegan diet, I'll allow peganism.
You could be quite varied with a pegan diet as well, because you got mushy peas, garden peas, petit pois.
Yeah. Stinky black eyed peas, dumb pea.
Yeah.
I can't remember all the Poddington peas now.
Yeah.
I was trying to go through the intro song to Poddington peas. Creepy. No, damn it. I used to know all the Poddington
For our
peas.
listeners outside of a very niche group of British people,
Yeah.
you might want to Google the Poddington peas.
And then keep it a secret now, please.
It is a great theme tune. I love the theme tune to Poddington Peas. He also sells a 10-day reset diet full of shakes and supplements. He is your old school diet-based woo. Also on Winster is the medical medium, who has 2.6 million followers, who claims that potatoes are a healing food for any chronic illness, symptom or condition, insisting that potatoes are antiviral, antibacterial and antifungal, that they keep the liver grounded and stable, because that's what you want your liver to be.
Okay.
That they're abundant in L-lysine, which inhibits viruses that cause chronic illnesses, and that they soothe the nerves and help with stress. He also claims that apples cleanse the liver, pears support the adrenals, and celery juice gives an instant immune system boost.
Doesn't the liver cleanse the liver?
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Is it that Quiipsos custodiat custodium or whatever it is? Who cleanses the cleanser?
There's Kellyanne Petrucci, who has 57.8 thousand followers and sells the bone broth diet. And even Deepak Chopra is getting in on the action with his 2.2 million followers.
Bloody hell, 2.2 million for Chopra.
Well, so just as a comparison, Mark Hyman has 1.1 million followers on Instagram. On Twitter, which he's been using since 2008, he just has 192.8 thousand followers. So significantly fewer than his Instagram account. The Medical Medium has 2.6 million followers on Instagram and 117.9 thousand followers on Twitter. Only Deepak Chopra has more followers on his Twitter account than his Instagram, with 3.2 million Twitter followers compared to 2.6 million on Instagram. Instagram has become the place to reach people. And I think as skeptics, we often overlook it. And I think that's partly an age thing, that we tend to skew a bit older in our demographics, and we tend to skew a little bit more male in our demographics. And Instagram is generally seen as a place where women go. And I think we overlook it. That, you know, those are sweeping generalizations, but I think probably some of those things play in a little bit, and we need to not overlook it.
It's certainly fair to characterize it as something we overlook. I think it certainly is.
I mean, I don't have an Instagram account, so yes, yes, I overlook it.
There are plenty of people doing good skepticism and debunking things over on Instagram, but often with far fewer followers, even than the Liverpool gyms against lockdown, which only sprang up a month ago. And I don't really have a way to finish this story. I don't have an answer. Do we do more skeptical work on Instagram? I don't know if that will help. I honestly don't know. But we do need to be aware that it's a massive tool for people pushing all of the terrible things that we talk about on the podcast, and we need to take it seriously. It's not the baby social media for young folk who want to post their dinner anymore. It's where people rally and proliferate dangerous ideas.
So QED, we announced on the show last week that we are incapable, unable, restricted, prevented from doing QED 2020. And so we decided we're going to do QED 2018 again.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that we're incapable of doing QED 20. We are more than capable. We're just not allowed. Like, we've got all the competencies. We've got it all up our sleeves, mate. We've got competency coming out of our arse. We're just not allowed to do anything with that.
And so QED 2018 again is going to be this weekend. It's going to be the weekend of the 14th and 15th of November 2020. So, Marsh, do you want to give us a run through of what's going on with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see all of it on Twitch starting at 10 a.m. on Saturday the 14th. We'll be running through some of our favourite talks from the main stage on the Twitch channel, twitch.tv/QEDCon. And then we'll simultaneously be running some of our favourite panels and podcasts and other stuff from 2018 over at the Skeptics in the Pub online Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/SITP. And everybody's there. Well, everybody's welcome. It's free, so we're not charging anybody to do this. You just pop along. You can join in the chat there. There'll be people sort of conversing as we go. And we'll be having, I think it's 5 talks on the Saturday, 4 talks on the Sunday, starting at 10, starting again on the Sunday. We'll be doing a live Incredulous on the evening of Saturday the 14th. That's going to be at 7 p.m. on the QED Twitch channel. That's going to be hosted by Andy Wilson, featuring me and Heath Enright from God Awful Movies and Scathing Atheist, Cara Santamaria from Talk Nerdy and The Skeptics Guide, and Brian Ego from Glasgow Skeptics. So it should be just like a really fun time if you're missing hanging out with a load of skeptics, hanging out with the folk at QED and that kind of that lovely kind of community that we have. If you were there and if you remember QED 2018, it was such a lovely feeling and it feels like an absolute fucking lifetime ago. And you can come and relive it with us on Twitch. And all that information is available at QEDcon.org.
And Alice, do you want to give us an update on what's happening with Skeptics in the Pub online?
Yeah, so as we say every episode, Skeptics in the Pub Online is a collaboration between Skeptics in the Pub groups around the country. We came together during the pandemic situation to kind of have something social that people could do and host skeptical talks because we didn't want to miss out on that while we were all in lockdown. So we're doing all those online. So this week we've got Steve Barrett, who will be giving a talk about UFOs. Are there any images that require an extraterrestrial explanation? And that'll be taking place from 7 p.m. on the Skeptics in the Pub Online Twitch, which is twitch.tv/SITP.
And so next week, we've got Pixie Turner as well, who, speaking of people who debunk bullshit on Instagram, she does an awful lot of that. And she's going to be talking about a lot of the stuff she sees on social media and what we can do about it and how it's spreading and the ways in which we can start to push back. So she's going to be talking about that again on Thursday 19th from 7 p.m. on twitch.tv/SITP. She's going to be speaking from 7:30 because from 7 to 7:30, we're going to be announcing the winners of this year's Occam Awards. So obviously, we've been asking you to submit your nominations for skeptical activism of the last year and also for the Rusty Razor Award for biggest pseudoscience of the last year. We've got all those nominations now, and we're going through them all and figuring out what the trends are and which ones we think stand out. And we'll be announcing all of that on the Skeptics in the Pub Twitch channel from 7 p.m. on Thursday 19th. So if you're interested, make sure you're there then.
Aside from that, then I think that is all we've got time for.
I believe so.
All that remains then is for me to thank Marsh for coming along today.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to Alice.
Thank you.
We have been Skeptics with a K, and we will see you next time.
Bye now.
Bye.
Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society. For more information, visit our website www.merseysideskeptics.org.uk or email podcast@merseysideskeptics.org.uk.